So children nationwide shared the same feelings expressed by Portland young people. The atmosphere in schools on Monday, December 8th was a mixture of shock, confusion, and fear. Everyone seemed slightly stunned as they gathered in Deering High School auditorium to hear President Roosevelt's Day of Infamy speech. After the initial shock faded, Americans settled into the routines of a nation at war. Parents were urged to discuss the war frankly and calmly with their children. Barbara Bean Kane, 12 years old when the war started, recalls that she did not feel afraid at the time. The war was just something that was happening. Virginia Bean Noble, age 7 in 1941, echoed those feelings, stating that although she and her friends watched the war newsreels at the movies, they didn't frighten her. The war was something they all just became accustomed to. One of the earliest war-related changes to affect children was a national trend for families to move. By December 1941, thousands of families had already relocated to work in defense industries. During the course of the war, over 30 million Americans, that's 1/5 of the nation's population, moved. Portland was one of many war industry boom towns in the country and absorbed thousands of new families attracted to the area by employers such as the Todd Bath Shipbuilding. With the increased population came an increased need for children's services. Portland had 19 schools in 1942, but they could not handle the expected rise in student enrollment. By 1943, federal monies had been used to build a new 12-room school building and to begin construction of a new junior high school in Portland, with plans underway for 2 more elementary schools. Otisfield, by contrast, maintained a steady enrollment during the war years, totaling between 76 and 84 students from sub-primary through grade 8, spread over 4 schools. Families in Otisfield appear to have stayed put. As the war dragged on and a severe labor shortage developed, those who wished to take a high-paying job at the shipyard did not need to move. They rode buses that came to Otisfield or to Oxford and Harrison to transport workers down to the shipyard. Farming families were doing work considered vital to the war effort, and they were encouraged by the government to stay on the farm. By early 1943, Maine was experiencing a severe shortage of trained teachers. Several hundred had accepted higher-paying jobs in Massachusetts, and others had found work at the shipyard. By 1943, 50 schools statewide were without a teacher. It was estimated that 1,000 students were without a school, and as a result, some would not be able to attend school at all that year. The Maine Commissioner of Education urged that local school boards increase teachers' pay to encourage them to stay in their jobs, but ultimately, retired teachers were pressed into service to fill the need. Otisfield, which had been able to keep 4 schools open through 1943, was not immune to the teacher shortage problem. Even though the superintendent stated in her annual report for the year ending February 1, 1943, that she felt Otisfield had done a better job than most due to the hard work of school officials and the help of parents in the community, she warned that it was very uncertain that all teaching positions in Otisfield could be filled for the coming year. Indeed, by September of 1943, 1 school had closed, and by 1944, only 2 schools remained open, East Otisfield and Spurs Corner. Otisfield followed the statewide trend of pressing retired teachers into service. Olga Bean had been retired from teaching for several years, but re-entered the workforce in 1943 to teach at the Gore, moving to the East Otisfield School the following year when the Gore School closed, and Pearl Pico taught at Spurs Corner. Teachers faced new challenges in the classroom as a result of the war. In November of 1941, slightly before Pearl Harbor, all schools in Portland began conducting regular air raid drills, and a plan was prepared providing for the safety of the children in the event of an actual air raid. There were air raid observation towers in Otisfield and in nearby towns. I understand that Bell Hill Church was used as an observation point, and there was a tower in Oxford near Chris and Marcia Pottle's house on Route 26 that had originally been located at the Perkins farm on McGuire Hill. As the war progressed, obtaining books, ordinary writing paper, and other supplies used in the classroom became challenging, if not impossible. The Otisfield Superintendent of Schools reported in early 1943 that supplies, including paper and books, had gone up in price, and some would not be able to be obtained. The federal government had requisitioned the facilities of large book companies for military use. Gas rationing had a severe impact on rural schools, where nearly everyone would need to drive to reach school-related events. By the end of 1942, Otisfield schools had canceled nearly all school special activities due to gas rationing. And this must have created quite a void in a town that had been used to large school pageants at Christmas and graduation that included performances by a school chorus and a children's harmonica band. Otisfield schools were receiving aid from the Work Project Administration, which was a New Deal relief agency, prior to the war, and this aid continued with changes into the war years. 3 of the schools had hot lunches served by a cook provided by the WPA. They received some supplies for these dinners from the federal school lunch program, but much of the food was furnished by parents and the community. Evidently, prior to the war, the practice was for families to share the leftovers, including anything that had been furnished by the government. But with war rationing and shortages, that soon changed. In 1942, the superintendent issued a stern warning that none of the supplies from the federal government were allowed to go to the homes that year under severe penalty. She explained that these supplies were not from surplus commodities as they had been in the past, and were strictly for use in the schools, as the surplus commodities program had been discontinued in 1941. Repairs to school buildings had to be postponed due to the labor shortage. And Otisfield dealt with gas rationing, repair problems, and the teacher shortage in one fell swoop, really, by closing schools. At the beginning of the war, there were schools in Spurs Corner, the Gore, Bell Hill, and East Otisfield, and the school on the Rayville Road was open briefly from 1941 to 1943, I believe. By war's end, only 2 schools remained open, Spurs Corner and East Otisfield. In early 1943, the idea was first mentioned to expand the East Otisfield school to 2 rooms in order to save on transportation cost by being able to close the Rayville school. The Bell Hill school had already been closed. The school at Spurs Corner finally closed, and in 1948, following the war, the school buildings at Rayville, Bell Hill, South Otisfield, and Spurs Corner were returned to the town, leaving only the East Otisfield school open. Although Otisfield's several one-room schools certainly would have consolidated eventually, it's clear that the war brought an early closure to most of its schools and an end to the small neighborhood school system in town. While children were learning about the war, they were also doing their part to help win it. Students nationwide regularly purchased war stamps and war bonds in school. Otisfield students did their part, with the superintendent reporting in 1944 that many children were buying war stamps and bonds regularly. Virginia Noble recalls buying her war bonds at school in East Otisfield. During the course of the war, school war bond sales topped $1 billion nationwide. Children could perform a variety of other war promotion tasks, which they did with gusto. Students rolled bandages, made civilian defense armbands, collected milkweed fluff, which was used as a substitute for kapok and life jackets. They collected books for GIs, they knitted socks, and participated in salvage drives. Aluminum, rubber, metal, and burlap bags were recycled with the help of children. In December 1942, 9 children, 3 each from Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont, were rewarded for being the top scrap collectors in their states by being named sponsors of 3 Liberty ships. The children were present as special guests when the ships were launched in South Portland. Otisfield children participated in war promotion efforts with an enthusiasm that impressed their superintendent. She reported in 1944 that, quote, the schools have all been of very great help in all of the salvage drives, collecting metals and paper in almost unbelievable quantities, end of quote. Children still had time for play during the war years, although their toys and games did change somewhat. Jokes about the war, especially Hitler, were popular. And here's a few cartoons, and there's a slightly off-color one on the back. And military games were popular. Pretending to be pilots appealed to some, while other children played a game called Japs and Germans, which was a variation on Cowboys and Indians. Children in one main school divided themselves into Allied and Axis forces during recess play, with each side experiencing occasional victories. Jean Hankins, now of Otisfield, but growing up in Massachusetts, recalls breaking household trinkets marked "Made in Japan" as a game played with her sister with the full knowledge and approval of the elders. Many toys were scarce, especially those made of rubber or metal, and most children had toys made of wood, which was plentiful. Toys with a war theme abounded. One could find victory paint-by-number sets, fighters for freedom jigsaw puzzles, toy battleships and fighter planes, and even a hobby knife shaped like a military plane. Bicycles became impossible to find, so kids either shared or they did without. Movie attendance soared during the war, and children attended in record numbers. A show cost 10 or 15 cents, but many children earned free admission by bringing in items for salvage. In 1942, Portland theaters were offering free admission to kids who brought in either 5 pounds of scrap metal or 2 pounds of rubber. Otisfield resident Irene Wiley occasionally filled her car with local children and took them to the movies in Norway, which I think was a clever way to share the gas rationing as well as sharing a good time. Despite the many changes brought by the war, most kids managed to enjoy a relatively normal childhood. They were enthusiastic supporters of the war in countless ways, which doubtless actually helped to win the war. Portland and Otisfield teenagers, okay, we're halfway, were no less involved in the war than the area's younger children, and nowhere was that more evident than in the area schools. Portland and Deering high schools sponsored numerous clubs and athletic teams which carried full programs throughout the war years, although sometimes altered to fit wartime demands. Both of the school's yearbooks contained several pages of photos, drawings, and essays related to the war, including photos of the Liberty ships produced in South Portland. And here is the Portland High School Amethyst yearbook for 1943. And if you look at the first few pages, you'll see just what I'm talking about. Drawings, war-related drawings, photographs, and whatnot. Otisfield teens attended high school primarily in either Casco, Oxford, or Norway during the war years. Norway carried a full program of sports and clubs throughout the war. Norway High School yearbook, Caduceus, contained far less war-related material throughout the period than did the Portland High School yearbooks. Portland teens may have felt the reality of the war more sharply due to the presence of the shipyard and more frequent war-related activities such as send-off parades for the enlisted men and dances where the presence of men in uniform was common. School clubs in Portland and Norway participated in scrap drives, victory gardens, and war bond sales. Students collected clothing for Bundles for Britain. They knitted hats and scarves for soldiers. Sarah Cowan recalled allowing her students to knit during class time as long as they didn't need their hands for schoolwork, such as taking notes. Portland schools restructured their school programs to fit wartime needs. Gym class at Portland High School was no longer seen as playtime, but was now viewed as time for, quote, strengthening bodies for the rigors to which they may soon be exposed. The wood shop made chairs for the Red Cross and USO. And this is a wonderful picture. They also made wooden model airplanes, which were used by the military. And these are pictures from the yearbook showing the kids in their woodshop class. Curriculums underwent wartime changes along with the clubs. In 1942, the federal government appropriated $30,000 for war industry training at Portland High School. New classes included machine shop, elementary ship construction, elementary radio, which was open to both boys and girls, and a one-year navigation course. The home economics laboratory was used as a community canning center, and clinics were held in the classrooms by the Nursing Association. The student shops or the shop students at both schools in Portland made dozens of model airplanes for defense use, and that's what you see in the picture circulating around. In more rural Norway, the Future Farmers Club at Norway High School responded to war needs with vigor. Although other groups had war-related activities, such as the junior class of 1942's air raid shelter party, and I'd love to know what they did at their air raid shelter party, and the efforts of the home economics students to try to do their part, the Future Farmers members reported significant activity in response to the war. Agriculture and farming were promoted by the government as vital to the nation's defense, and membership in the Future Farmers Club reflects that elevated status. Membership state and nationwide grew rapidly, and Norway High's numbers reflected the national trend, jumping by 1/3 between 1940 and 1943. Norway Future Farmers received many requests from local farmers for help. In 1943, they picked 4,000 bushels of apples, harvested 5 acres of corn, in addition to using their school laboratory to dress 340 turkeys and fowl and to hatch 8,000 eggs. The following year, they picked 800 bushels of apples, dug 5 acres of potatoes, and dressed over 1,000 turkeys and chickens. Given the severe labor shortage, the help of the Future Farmers Club surely saved some farmers' crops from spoilage. Students were regular and apparently enthusiastic purchasers of war stamps and bonds. At Norway, students purchased these items, but they were also being given by the school as awards and prizes. At Deering, the school newspaper encouraged students to buy bonds with frequent editorials and slogans such as "Hit Hitler," "Muss Mussolini," "Nip and Nipponese," "Buy a bond and slap a Jap across the pond." Discipline became a problem in schools throughout the nation. Miss Cowan sensed a great deal of tension and pressure among the students at Deering, which led to behavior problems. Several former Deering students were taken prisoner at the Battle of the Bulge. This left Deering High a very gloomy place, she reported, and many students had friends or relatives involved. And in the Deering High newspaper, there's even a little blurb right here, which is really encouraging the kids to behave well. A major difference between the experiences of younger children and teens was the reality of the draft for boys. The fact that teenagers fought the Second World War is, to me, remarkable. At the war's beginning, the minimum draft age in the United States was 21, but by war's end, it had been dropped to 18. By early 1942, the Army was asking 18 and 19-year-olds, then below draft age, to volunteer to help meet the growing manpower needs. The Army expected to enlist a lot of first-class fighting men from this group, and in fact, they expected that over 80% of new voluntary enlistments would be 18 and 19-year-olds. In Norway, of 28 senior boys in 1943, 7 were already enlisted by graduation, with an additional 16 citing military service as their future plan. By 1945, that number had risen to 10 out of 11 remaining boys and 3 girls planning to join the military, and 6 boys were already away at war by graduation. The large numbers of young draft registrants, as well as the romanticized accounts of patriotic service found in high school publication, suggests a naivete among teenagers at that time about the realities of war. They did not seem to consider the dreadfulness of what they were training to do. Nearly all literary club submissions in the 1943, 44, and 45 Norway high school yearbook were patriotic war essays, including one that proclaimed, "We can find no truer patriots than our school children," another in praise of doing one's duty, and a third that declared, in a model of understatement, that an aircraft carrier is a very exciting place, especially in enemy waters. This student was a senior with plans to enter the Naval Air Corps, and he went on to rhapsodize about planes on an aircraft carrier as the sun poked its bright orange face over the horizon, being slowly raised to the deck by elevators in the cool, clear air of the fall morning, while the pilots were 3 floors below, eating a hearty aviator's breakfast. These images and more were supplied by a government war propaganda machine that knew what it needed to do in order to get boys to enlist willingly. By March 1943, the Marines were pre-enlisting 17-year-olds in Portland. In December, a War Department official told the Portland Teachers Association that the armed services expected nearly all 16 and 17-year-old boys to be enlisted by the time they were 18. It became common for boys to enlist prior to graduation. Barbara Kane's future husband, Bob, was typical. He joined the Marines and left school without graduating. When he came home, he did go back and earn his GED, although I don't think it was called GED at the time. Schools were being asked to develop programs which would train boys in skills valuable to the military, such as aircraft mechanics, carpentry, communications, and sheet metal work. Portland teachers were asked to urge all 16-year-old boys to have a physical exam so that any problems could be diagnosed and corrected before they were eligible to enlist. With younger and younger boys being asked to ready themselves for military service, it's no wonder that stress and tension were apparent in the students. The national manpower shortage affected not only the military, but the private sector as well. The labor shortage in Portland was acute by early 1943, and nearly any teen who wanted a job could get one, even teens as young as 14, due to the lowering of the minimum age requirement. Nationally, the number of working 14 to 17-year-olds doubled between July 1940 and July 1943. The availability of well-paid defense jobs contributed to a rise in the national dropout rate. Between 1940 and 1944, the number of working teens in the country increased by 200%, while the number of teens enrolled in school dropped by 24%. By 1944, 31% of all teens aged 14 to 17 were working, a number so significant that the Department of Labor reported in 1943 that teen workers being added to the labor force had a greater impact on increasing the pool of workers than the increased number of working women. In 1943, Norway High School adopted a morning-only schedule. The high school had seen an increase in absenteeism due to the number of students holding jobs. The shortened school day allowed students to go to school in the morning and work in the afternoon. Opportunities for a full social life in Portland were numerous. The pier at Old Orchard Beach was one of the places to go for fun. There was a dance every Saturday night and plenty of servicemen with whom to dance. In Norway and Oxford, the shortage of boys was keenly felt. Barbara Kane remembers that there were fewer and fewer boys around at Oxford High, and the teachers thought up activities for the girls as the boys disappeared one by one. In 1945, Norway High School's graduating class had 19 girls and only 11 boys. And in 1946, there were 14 boys with 22 girls. For many children, the fear of polio was at least as strong as the fear of war. Polio was the worst of a number of epidemics which swept the country during World War II. Otisfield's annual report does not list any polio-related deaths during the war years. However, the influenza epidemic did claim at least 2 persons. Barbara Kane remembers the concern over polio, but she did not know anyone who had it until she met her future husband, Bob, in 1947. He had a cousin with the disease who was confined to an iron lung. Well, VE and VJ days made different impressions on children depending on their ages. For younger children, it remains a vague mystery, or a vague memory. Betty Boyce, Betty Leach, and Virginia Noble have much more vivid memories of huge crowds on Congress Street and a New Year's Eve atmosphere that included a lot of kissing. Virginia was in Portland with June Wiley Tracy. She remembers fireworks, a huge crowd, and a lot of excitement. Children had different views of the war depending on their personal experiences. Some felt that the war had no effect on their lives at all. For them, it was business as usual. A larger group included children such as Virginia, who, despite feeling sheltered during the war, felt the fears and anxieties. Virginia remembers feeling fear and anger over a war that threatened to take her father away. She vividly remembers the day he went to Portland to take his physical for the draft. His knees were bad, and he did not have to serve, but she knew a number of local men and boys who did. And the war became much more real for her when veterans began returning and when some, including neighbor Herbert Edwards, were killed. Looking back, many children feel that the war forced them to grow up too soon. The vast majority, however, remember the war years as a time of excitement, patriotism, and national unity. Changes? Many. Excitement? There was plenty. Worries? There were a few. For most children, however, the war years are remembered as a positive period in their lives, and for some, perhaps even the best